This is a homily for the third Sunday of Lent. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. John, chapter 2, verses 13 to 25. If you would like to receive the text of my homilies as a PDF file, please email me at jeffreyplant47@gmail.com. Let's see where we now are on our Lenten journey. On the first Sunday of Lent, God's Spirit drove Jesus out into the desert where he was tested. On the second Sunday of Lent, Jesus, together with Peter, James, and John, ascended a high mountain, and there he was transfigured. A voice came from a cloud and said, "This is my Son, the Beloved, listen to him." Today, on this third Sunday of Lent, Jesus enters the temple precinct and drives out those selling cattle and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting at their counters. The desert is a place of testing. The mountain is a place of listening. This is my Son, the Beloved, listen to him. The temple, as we shall see, is the place of presence. All four of the evangelists give us an account of Jesus cleansing the temple. Today we have heard John's account of this episode, and you will have noticed one significant difference between the cleansing of the temple in the three synoptic Gospels and in John's Gospel. In John's Gospel, the cleansing of the temple is located towards the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, a few days after the wedding at Cana. This is the first of three Passover feasts mentioned in John's Gospel. In the three synoptic Gospels, the cleansing of the temple occurs at the beginning of Holy Week. In Matthew and Luke, Jesus does this on the day on which he enters Jerusalem in triumph. In Mark, he does it on the following day. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus enters Jerusalem on the day that we now call Palm Sunday. If we follow Mark's chronology, the cleansing of the temple occurs on the Monday of Holy Week in all three synoptic Gospels. And in all three synoptic Gospels there is a single Passover which is associated with the death of Jesus. It would seem that John has placed the cleansing of the temple towards the beginning of the public ministry of Jesus rather than at its close, because of his emphasis on the motif of divine presence in the world. I'll say more about this a little later. The changing of water into wine is the first of Jesus' signs in the Gospel of John. Jesus and his entourage leave Cana and go down to Capernaum, where they stay a few days. Notice that John says they are going down to Capernaum, even though they are travelling in a northeasterly direction. That is explained by the fact that Cana is almost 100 metres above sea level, while Capernaum is about 208 metres below sea level. So they are quite literally travelling down to Capernaum. John then tells us that the time of the Jewish Passover was near and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Again, notice that although Jesus and his disciples are travelling southwards, John tells us that they went up to Jerusalem. As we've seen, Capernaum is almost 208 metres below sea level. However, Jerusalem is 754 metres above sea level. So pilgrims travelling from the Galilee region quite literally went up to Jerusalem. Today's Gospel is set in the temple precincts, and here you can see what the temple looked like at the time of Jesus. By all accounts, it was a magnificent building. It was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. The Islamic shrine, the Dome of the Rock, now stands on the site of the temple. Today's scene of the cleansing of the temple would almost certainly have taken place in the outer courtyard, known as the Court of the Gentiles. John tells us that when Jesus enters the temple precinct, he finds people selling cattle and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting at their counters there. At this point, we could pause to ask, why are there people selling cattle and sheep and pigeons in the temple precinct, and why there are money changers there? New Testament scholar Gail O'Day explains, cattle, sheep and doves were required for burnt offerings in the temple. Since Passover was a pilgrimage feast, many of those coming to worship in the temple would have journeyed a great distance and would not have brought animals with them. They needed to buy animals in Jerusalem in order to participate in temple worship. Similarly, the temple tax could not be paid in Greek or Roman coinage because of the human image, the emperor's head, on these coins, and foreign coinage had to be changed into the legal Tyrian currency in Jerusalem. Therefore, the sale of animals and the changing of money were necessary if the worship of the cult was to proceed. Here you can see a Roman coin from the time of Jesus. On the one side it has an image of the emperor, Tiberius, with the words, Tiberius Caesar, Divi Augusti, Filius Augustus. Tiberius Caesar, august son of the divine Augustus. On the reverse side of the coin are the words Pontifex Maximus, High Priest. Such claims were highly offensive to devout Jews. Jesus fashions a whip and overturns the tables, telling the sellers and money changers, take all of this out of here and stop turning my Father's house into a market. Even though we're in the year of St. Mark, the lectionary chooses not Mark's version of the cleansing of the temple, but rather the account that we find in John's Gospel. I guess that's because John's account is more detailed and it offers us a deeper insight into what this episode is saying about Jesus. Before we look at this episode in closer detail, allow me to make some preliminary observations about reading this text, or indeed any text from the Bible. Firstly, to understand any biblical text, we need to know something about the world behind the text. So, for example, this episode is set in Jerusalem, which is in Judea, a province of the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD. How is that relevant for today's Gospel? The Roman garrison in the Antonia fortress would have been on high alert during Passover, when hundreds of thousands of pilgrims came to Jerusalem. The Romans would have dealt ruthlessly with any form of insurrection. The temple authorities knew that it was in their best interest to work hand in glove with the Roman authorities. So alarm bells would have begun ringing for the Jewish authorities when a charismatic preacher from Galilee caused a major disturbance in the temple precinct, in the very heart of the Jewish establishment. Secondly, we need to look at the world in the text itself. To understand what's happening in today's Gospel, we need to keep in mind where and when it's set. It is set just before the celebration of Passover, and this episode takes place in the Jewish temple. The temple was the beating heart of Jewish life. Let's consider Passover for a moment. Passover was one of 3 pilgrimage festivals. It commemorated God saving his people from slavery in Egypt and leading them to freedom in the Promised Land. The other 2 pilgrimage festivals were Pentecost and Tabernacles. They were called pilgrimage feasts because the Torah laid down in the books of Exodus and Deuteronomy that all men had to make a pilgrimage to the temple in Jerusalem for those 3 feasts. 3 times a year you will hold a festival in my honour. 3 times a year all your menfolk will appear before the Lord God. So, how many people would have made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem? The Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, a contemporary of Jesus, referred to countless multitudes attending the pilgrimage festivals. The Jewish historian Josephus writes that at one Passover, in the year 65 AD, there was not less than 3 million visitors. Modern authors are a little more circumspect. New Testament scholar Joachim Jeremias estimated attendance at the pilgrimage festivals to be around 200,000 pilgrims. E.P. Sanders estimated attendance to be somewhere between 300 and 500,000, especially for the feast of Passover. The temple was the house of God. It was the heart and centre of Judaism, the vital symbol around which everything else circled. It was the centre of Israel's national and political life. The temple was the most sacred place on earth, the navel of the universe, the axis mundi, and the temple was the only place where sacrifice could be offered. For most people in antiquity, the offering of sacrifices was a quintessential expression of religious piety. In the words of the Jewish historian Josephus, to think of leaving off those sacrifices is to every Jew plainly impossible. They would rather give up their lives than the worship which they are accustomed to offer God. Let's have a closer look at the temple that Jesus knew. As I've mentioned, today's gospel is most likely set in the courtyard of the Gentiles. As the name suggests, non-Jews were permitted to enter this courtyard, but they were unable to approach any closer to the temple than this. Those entering the Temple Mount had to remove their shoes, and many people made a point of dressing themselves in white. The soreg marked the boundary beyond which Gentiles could not pass. The soreg was a stone lattice-work fence which, according to the Jewish historian Josephus, was 1.5 metres or 5 foot high. Plaques written in both Latin and Greek were attached to the soreg, forbidding Gentiles to pass beyond that point under pain of death. One of these plaques, written in Greek, was found in 1870. It reads, "No stranger is to enter within the balustrade around the temple and enclosure. Whoever is caught will be responsible to himself for his death, which will ensue." If we pass through the eastern gate, we enter the court of the women. Both Jewish men and women could enter this courtyard. A gate, known as the Nicanor Gate, led into the court of the Israelites and the court of the priests. Women could not pass beyond the Nicanor Gate. The Nicanor gate led into the court of the Israelites and to the court of the priests. The court of the Israelites was open to all male Jews. The court of the priests was over a metre higher than the court of the Israelites. Men who were not priests could only enter the court of the priests when they were presenting an animal to be sacrificed. Here you can see the altar of burnt sacrifices, situated in front of the temple itself. This, as the name suggests, is where sacrifices were offered. The essential element of the daily temple service was the offering of the tamid sacrifice of 2 lambs, one in the morning, which began the service, and one in the afternoon, which concluded it. In the hours between these 2 services, various other sacrifices offered by individuals were brought forward. Within the temple there were 2 main spaces. Firstly, the sanctuary, or hekal in Hebrew. The altar of incense was located in the sanctuary. In chapter 1 of Luke's Gospel, we're told that Zechariah was offering incense here when the angel Gabriel appeared to him and told him that he and his wife Elizabeth will have a child whom they are to name John. The most sacred part of the temple, Kadosh HaKodoshim, the Holy of Holies, was separated from the sanctuary by 2 curtains. The only person permitted to enter the Holy of Holies was the high priest, and then on only one day of the year, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. In Greek, the temple proper was known as naos, and the outer court of the temple as hieron. This diagram gives you a simplified overview of the temple layout. So the importance of the temple is an integral part of the world in the text of today's Gospel. Finally, we have the world in front of the text. That refers to you and me, who are reading the text in the 21st century, which means that there is a gulf of over 2,000 years between the world behind and in the text and the world in front of the text. Let's now take up the idea of presence. We are, of course, talking of the divine presence among us. In John's Gospel, the key to understanding the divine presence among us is to be found in the prologue. In chapter 1, verse 14, we read, "The Word became flesh and lived among us, and we saw his glory." The Greek word that John used, translated here as lived, is eskenosen. The verb skenoo means to live in a tent, the word for tent being skene. A more literal translation would be, "The Word became flesh and pitched his tent among us." To understand what's happening here, we need to reflect upon the significance of the word tent. John the Evangelist takes for granted that his readers know that he's alluding to the tent of meeting. Chapters 25 to 27 of the book of Exodus contain instructions about constructing the tent of meeting. It was to be the place where God dwelt among his people. In front of the tent was the altar of burnt offerings. Sacrifices were offered here. Then there was the tent of God's presence. Inside the tent there was the holy place. And the holy place was separated from the Holy of Holies by a curtain known as the veil. The Holy of Holies, Kadosh HaKodoshim in Hebrew, was the inner sanctum of the tent of meeting, and accessible only to the high priest. The Ark of the Covenant rested in the Holy of Holies. The Ark of the Covenant contained the stone tablets Moses received from God on Mount Sinai. Listen to what happened once the tent of meeting had been finally erected. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled upon it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the word tabernacle is skene. In other words, the Greek word for tent. Notice also that the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. The Greek word used here is doxa. That is the same word that is used in the prologue to John's Gospel. And the Word became flesh and lived in a tent among us, and we have seen his glory. John's use of both tent and glory are his way of telling us who Jesus is. He is the divine presence living among us. Once the people had entered the Promised Land, they are led by charismatic leaders known as judges. The Hebrew word to judge is shavat, which can also be translated as decide, judge, rule, govern, vindicate, or deliver. The period of judges lasts for 175 years. You might think that once the people had entered the Promised Land, they would have built a temple straight away. The tent which housed the ark is, after all, associated with a nomadic life, and they're now a settled people. However, nothing happens straight away. The tent of meeting remained the place where God dwelt among his people. When the people eventually decided that they wanted a king to rule over them, the prophet Samuel anointed Saul as the first king of Israel in 1030 BC. He was succeeded by David, and David was succeeded by his son Solomon. For a generation and more, the ark wandered from place to place, until David finally brought it to Mount Zion. About 1000 BC, David conquered the ancient city of Jerusalem and made it his capital. He wanted to build a temple in Jerusalem, but the prophet Nathan dissuaded him, telling the king that that was a task to be undertaken by his son. Solomon completed the project around 950 BC, and at the dedication he prayed, "I have now built for you a stately house, a place where you may dwell forever." The first book of Kings tells us about the dedication of Solomon's new temple once it is completed. The priests bring the Ark of the Covenant to its place in the inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies. And then we're told that once the priests came out of the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and because of the cloud, the priests could not stay and perform their duties, for the glory of the Lord filled the temple of the Lord. So now it is the temple, and no longer the tent of meeting, where God dwells among his people. The divine presence rests in the Holy of Holies. Here you can see what Solomon's temple looked like. However, Solomon's temple is destroyed by the Babylonians in the 6th century BC. The Babylonians are in turn conquered by the Persians, who allow the Jews to return home from exile in Babylon to begin the task of rebuilding their temple. A huge task lay ahead of them. Jerusalem had been destroyed, and the temple was a pile of rubble. They set about rebuilding the temple, and it was dedicated in 515 BC. Sadly, they did not have the resources to adorn it with the same splendour as the former building, and to many it was a disappointment. In the prophet Haggai, we read that those people who were old enough to remember what Solomon's temple had looked like thought that this second temple was as nothing in comparison. It's not until several hundred years later, during the reign of King Herod, that work began on restoring the temple. Herod's grandiose project so frightened the Jews that he had to promise that he would have all the materials ready before touching a stone of the old edifice. It was finally completed in 63 AD. You can see here the city of Jerusalem from above, with the temple precinct outlined. This is the temple that Jesus knew. It was, by any standards, a magnificent building. Now, all of this is necessary background if we are to understand what is really happening in today's gospel. The so-called cleansing of the temple isn't about getting rid of money changers and merchants selling animals. As we've seen, both of those activities were necessary for the temple to function properly. The Jewish authorities challenged Jesus over what he has just done. "What sign can you show us to justify what you have done?" Jesus replies, "Destroy this sanctuary, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The verb destroy is an aorist imperative, second person plural. So Jesus is saying you, plural, so he's addressing the authorities, you destroy this sanctuary, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The authorities must be thinking that they've got a madman on their hands. "It has taken 46 years to build this sanctuary. Are you going to raise it up in 3 days? They, of course, misunderstand what he has just said, because in the dramatic irony typical of such dialogues in John's Gospel, the authorities perceive only the literal sense and miss the underlying meaning. But it's not only the authorities who fail to understand. John tells us that even the disciples understood only later in light of the resurrection. At this point in the story, John the Evangelist provides us with some help by telling us that Jesus wasn't talking about a building. He was talking rather about the sanctuary that was his body. Here we have a radical relocation of the divine presence in the world. So, how should we understand the actions of Jesus in the temple? Could I suggest that the best way to understand what Jesus did is to see it as a prophetic gesture or as an acted-out parable of judgment? The Hebrew prophets often dramatised or acted out their message. Here's an example of what I mean. The prophet Jeremiah lived in Jerusalem at a time when Babylon was the superpower of the region. The Jewish king Zedekiah thought that he'd be strong enough to resist a Babylonian invasion. But Jeremiah receives a word from the Lord. Don't even think of it. Resistance will be futile. So we read, "In the beginning of the reign of King Zedekiah, son of Josiah of Judah, the word came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Thus the Lord said to me, Make yourself a yoke of straps and bars, and put them on your neck." And that's exactly what Jeremiah did. He dramatically enacted out the word of the Lord. It was to be a sign to the people. You will survive if you bring your necks under the yoke of the king of Babylon and serve him and his people. But the king refuses to listen to God's word. He wasn't going to surrender to the Babylonians. And so Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, marched on Jerusalem. The city was destroyed, and the temple was left a pile of rubble. So think of what Jesus does in today's Gospel as something similar to Jeremiah's acted out proclamation. If Jeremiah was warning the people not to resist the Babylonians, what is Jesus saying when he casts out the animal sellers and money changers? This prophetic gesture is not saying that the institution of the temple needs to be reformed. He is saying that the days of the temple are numbered. The Jerusalem temple has been replaced by the body of Jesus as the true holy place, as the place of mediation between God and human beings. Jesus is the Word made flesh. He is the place where the glory of God has chosen to pitch its tent and dwell among us. Whereas once only the high priest could enter into the divine presence, and then on only one day of the year, now through Jesus we all have access to the Holy of Holies. Pope Benedict explains it this way: the rejection and crucifixion of Jesus means at the same time the end of this temple. The era of the temple is over. A new worship is being introduced in a temple not built by human hands. This temple is his body, the risen one, who gathers the peoples and unites them in the sacrament of his body and blood. He himself is the new temple of humanity. The crucifixion of Jesus is at the same time the destruction of the old temple. With his resurrection, a new way of worshipping God begins, no longer on this or that mountain, but in spirit and truth.